There's a photograph that no one talks about. It sits in a private collection in Massachusetts, never displayed, never published, never acknowledged by the family whose name it carries. The woman in the frame wears silk that cost more than most Americans would earn in a lifetime. Her eyes are dark, her posture perfect, her expression carefully neutral. She looks like royalty, because she was. But here's what makes historians go quiet when they see it. She died in America under a different name, buried in a pauper's grave, her children scattered to orphanages and asylums, her bloodline deliberately erased from every record that mattered. They found her death certificate in 2003. It listed her occupation as washerwoman. They found her baptismal records 3 years later in a crumbling parish outside Prague. It listed her title as princess. The gap between those two documents is where the horror lives. Her name was Franziska Johanna von Habsburg-Lothringen. Born in 1847 in a palace that no longer exists, fourth in line to a throne that would collapse within her lifetime, and heir to a genetic curse that European nobility had been quietly carrying for 300 years. She came to America in 1872, not as an immigrant seeking opportunity, but as a fugitive running from something the family wouldn't name in letters. The Austrian court paid for her passage. They paid for her silence. They paid, most importantly, for her to never return. By 1875, she was living in a tenement in Pennsylvania under the name Frances Johnson. By 1880, she had 4 children, no husband on record, and a reputation in the neighborhood as the strange woman who spoke to people who weren't there. By 1889, she was dead. Officially, it was typhoid, but the attending physician's notes, discovered in 2011, tell a different story. He wrote 4 words in the margin of her file, then crossed them out so violently the pen tore through the paper. You can still read them if you hold the document to the light, same as the mother. The Habsburg family didn't just rule Austria. They ruled Spain, Hungary, Bohemia, and at their height, controlled territory that stretched from the Netherlands to Naples. They married only each other, cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, keeping the blood pure, keeping the throne secure, keeping the wealth inside the family. For 5 centuries this worked. Then it didn't. By the time Franziska was born, the genetic consequences of 300 years of inbreeding had become impossible to hide. The famous Habsburg jaw, the underbite so severe that some emperors couldn't chew their food. The seizures, the stillbirths, the children born with conditions that didn't have names yet, that wouldn't have names for another 100 years. But there was something else. Something the family physicians documented in private journals that were sealed by court order and wouldn't be opened until 1978. They called it the melancholy. We would call it something different now. Franziska's mother, Archduchess Maria Annunziata, spent the last 12 years of her life in a private wing of Schönbrunn Palace that had bars on the windows. The official story was tuberculosis. The servants knew better. They heard her screaming at night, long monologues directed at family members who'd been dead for decades, entire conversations with her children, who were still alive and terrified in rooms down the hall. The court physician, Dr. Eduard von Habsburg, kept meticulous notes. He described episodes where the Archduchess would become convinced that her skin was infested with insects that no one else could see, where she would refuse food for weeks, certain it was poisoned by rivals at court who didn't exist, where she would lock herself in her chambers and write letters in a language that wasn't quite German, wasn't quite anything, page after page of words that almost made sense but didn't. In his final report before her death in 1871, he wrote a single sentence that the family tried to have stricken from the record. The condition appears in her daughter. Franziska was 24 years old. She'd been married briefly to a minor German count who annulled the marriage within 6 months, citing reasons the court sealed. She'd given birth to a child who died at 3 days old, cause of death unlisted. And she'd begun to show signs of what her mother had. The Habsburg family physician examined her in January of 1872. His recommendation was immediate and unambiguous. She could not marry again. She could not remain at court. She could not, under any circumstances, be allowed to have more children. The family made a decision. They gave her money, a fake name, and a one-way ticket to New York. They told the court she died of scarlet fever. They held a funeral with an empty coffin, and they never spoke her name again. She arrived in America in March of 1872. The passenger manifest lists her as Frances Johnson, age 26, traveling alone, no family contact listed. She had 3 trunks with her. When those trunks were finally traced and opened in 2009 by a researcher working on immigrant histories, they contained things that made no sense for a woman traveling under an assumed name. Court dresses with the Habsburg crest carefully cut away, jewelry that had been pried from its settings, the gold melted down, the stones reset in cheaper metal, letters in sealed envelopes addressed to people with titles never sent, and a medical diary written in Franziska's own hand, documenting symptoms that started on the voyage across the Atlantic: insomnia, auditory hallucinations, a growing certainty that the other passengers were discussing her in whispers, plotting against her, working for the family she'd left behind. On the final page, dated 2 days before the ship docked, she wrote something that researchers still argue about. "I hear mother in the walls. She says I brought it with me. She ended up in Scranton, Pennsylvania. No one knows why Scranton. The city's records show a Frances Johnson renting a room in a boarding house on Lackawanna Avenue in April 1872, employed as a seamstress. Her landlady's diary, discovered in an estate sale in 1998, describes her as refined, well-educated, and deeply strange. She would work through the night, talking to herself in what sounded like multiple languages. She refused to eat food she hadn't prepared herself. She kept the curtains drawn even during the day and would sometimes stand at the window for hours, watching the street below as if expecting someone. In June of 1873, she gave birth to a daughter. There was no husband, no father listed on the birth record. The child was named Johanna, after Franziska's middle name. The midwife who delivered the baby told neighbors that Franziska had screamed through the entire labor, not in pain, but in terror, begging them not to let it take the child. When they asked what she meant, she went silent and wouldn't speak for 3 days. By 1875, there were 3 more children, all girls, all born within 2 years of each other, all with different fathers that Franziska would never name. The neighbors began to talk. The church began to ask questions. And Franziska began to unravel in ways that even the landlady, who'd seen her share of troubled women, found disturbing. She would dress the children in clothes she'd sewn herself, elaborate dresses that mimicked the court fashion she'd grown up in, and parade them through the tenement hallway, announcing their titles to bewildered neighbors. She would lock them in their room for days, convinced that someone was coming to take them back to Austria, back to the family, back to the palace with the barred windows. She wrote letters to the Austrian consulate in New York, dozens of them, demanding protection, demanding recognition, demanding that they acknowledge who she really was. The consulate never responded. They had no record of anyone by her name. She didn't exist, not anymore. The children saw everything. Johanna, the eldest, kept a diary that wasn't discovered until 2015. tucked inside the wall of a building being demolished in Scranton. She was 7 years old when she started writing. The entries are brief, written in careful script that suggests someone taught her penmanship the way royalty would be taught. But the content is the kind of thing that makes archivists go quiet when they read it. She describes her mother standing in the center of their room at midnight, speaking to empty air in a formal register, as if addressing a court. She describes being woken up and told to pack their belongings because they were fleeing, only to have her mother forget by morning and punish her for the scattered clothes. She describes a night when her mother cut all their hair off with sewing scissors, sobbing that it was the only way to keep them safe, that they would recognize them by their hair. And she describes, in an entry from December 1878, her mother telling her something that Johanna clearly didn't understand at the time. She said, "We have bad blood." She said it's in us, the way it was in her, the way it was in grandmother. She said it makes us see things that aren't there and believe things that aren't true. She said it's the price we pay for being born who we are. Franziska tried to fight it. The medical diary she kept, the one found in her trunk, continues through these years. She documented her own decline with the detachment of someone trained to observe, trained to record, even as the subject was herself. She wrote about periods of clarity where she understood that the voices weren't real, that the threats weren't real, that she was ill in a way that had no cure. Then she wrote about periods where that clarity vanished and she was certain, absolutely certain, that agents of the Habsburg court were living in the boarding house, watching her children, waiting for the right moment to act. She dosed herself with laudanum to sleep. Then she stopped sleeping because she didn't trust what happened when she was unconscious. She tried to find doctors who would understand what she was describing without committing her to an asylum. No one did. In America, in 1878, a woman who claimed to be Austrian royalty and heard voices was either a liar or insane. There was no third option. The breaking point came in January of 1880. A neighbor found Johanna and her sisters locked in a closet, hungry and terrified, while Franziska barricaded the door with furniture and screamed at someone in the hallway who wasn't there. The police were called. Franziska was briefly detained, then released when she became lucid enough to explain it away as a misunderstanding, a moment of panic, nothing more. But the children were taken, not by the state, not officially, but by the church. The priest at St. Mary's had been watching the family for months, had seen enough to know that the children weren't safe, and had connections to Catholic orphanages that would take them without asking too many questions. Franziska fought. She went to the police, to the courts, to anyone who would listen, demanding her children back, showing documents she claimed proved her identity, her lineage, her right to be taken seriously. They looked at the documents. They were real, authenticated seals, noble signatures, records of birth in a palace, and they dismissed them anyway because this was America, and in America, crazy women with delusions of grandeur didn't get their children back. Franziska died alone 9 years later. The death certificate, filed in February 1889, lists her as Frances Johnson, washerwoman, aged 40, 2, cause of death typhoid fever. She was buried in a mass grave at Dunmore Cemetery, a potter's field where the city buried indigents and unclaimed bodies. No marker, no record of exactly where in the trench her remains were placed. The attending physician was Dr. Samuel Garrett, a general practitioner who worked primarily with the poor. His casebook was donated to the Lackawanna Historical Society in 1974. The entry for Frances Johnson is longer than it should be. He describes a patient in the final stages of fever, delirious, unresponsive to treatment, standard enough, Then he describes something else. He writes that in her lucid moments she spoke about her children with a clarity that disturbed him. She knew their names, their ages, where they'd been sent, and she knew with absolute certainty that they would inherit what she had. That it was already starting in the eldest, that there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. He asked her what she meant. She told him about her mother, about the palace with the barred windows, about the family that had carried this in their blood for generations, hidden it, denied it, called it melancholy when it was something worse. He didn't believe her, not then, but he wrote it down, and then, in the margin, he wrote those 4 words. Same as the mother. Then he crossed them out. The children were scattered. Johanna, the eldest, was sent to St. Joseph's orphanage in Wilkes Barre. Records show she stayed there until age 16, then disappeared from all documentation until 1901, when she was admitted to the state hospital for the insane in Harrisburg. The admission papers describe a young woman suffering from severe delusional episodes, convinced she was being hunted by foreign agents, convinced her real family was royalty, convinced that the other patients were plotting to poison her. The attending psychiatrist noted that her symptoms were remarkably similar to cases he'd read about in European medical journals, studies of hereditary madness in isolated populations where intermarriage was common. He wrote a paper about her case, published in 1903, changing her name to protect her identity. He titled it Hereditary Psychosis in a subject claiming noble lineage. The paper describes her decline in clinical detail. The voices that started in her early 20s, the paranoia that made her unable to work, unable to trust anyone, the eventual catatonia. She died in the asylum in 1924, aged 51. She was buried on the hospital grounds, in a cemetery reserved for patients whose families never claimed them. Her sisters followed similar paths. One made it to age 30 before the symptoms began. One showed signs as early as 14. All of them ended up in institutions. All of them died there, and all of them, according to the psychiatrists who treated them, showed the same pattern. A hereditary condition, passed from mother to daughter, that destroyed their ability to distinguish reality from delusion. The doctors couldn't cure it. They could barely understand it, but they documented it. Page after page of case notes describing women who believed they were royalty, who heard voices in languages they shouldn't know, who saw threats that didn't exist. The doctors assumed it was all delusion. The ravings of sick minds. They never considered that some of it might be true, that these women really were descended from royalty, that the voices they heard might have been memories, genetic echoes of ancestors who'd gone mad in palaces across Europe. That the condition they suffered from wasn't random, but the inevitable result of 3 centuries of keeping the bloodline pure. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The story should have ended there. A forgotten princess, dead children, a bloodline that destroyed itself in American asylums while the world moved on. But it didn't end, because Johanna had a daughter. The records are fragmentary, pieced together from asylum logs and church registries and census data that doesn't quite match. Sometime around 1899, before her final commitment, Johanna gave birth to a girl. The father is unknown, the circumstances are unknown. What is known is that the child was taken immediately, placed with a Catholic family in Philadelphia who were told nothing about the mother except that she was unfit. The child was baptized Mary Catherine Sullivan. She grew up believing she was Irish. She had no idea who her grandmother was, no idea what she'd inherited. She made it further than the others. She married at 22, had 3 children, lived a relatively normal life until her mid-40s. Then the symptoms started. Her daughter, Margaret, described it in an oral history recorded in 1989, when she was 73 years old. She said her mother began to change in 1943. Started having dreams that felt more real than waking life. Dreams of places she'd never been, palaces and ballrooms and people in old-fashioned clothes who spoke to her in German. Started becoming convinced that their neighbors were watching the house, reporting on them to authorities that Margaret's mother couldn't name. Started talking about blood, about ancestry, about things that were passed down through generations, whether you wanted them or not. Margaret thought it was stress, the war, her father being overseas, but it got worse. Her mother would lock herself in the bathroom and have conversations with the mirror, speaking in a language that wasn't English, wasn't anything Margaret recognized. She would grab Margaret's face and stare into her eyes, searching for something, then burst into tears and beg her forgiveness. When Margaret asked what for, her mother would only say, "You'll understand when it starts in you." Margaret was 15 when her mother was committed. The diagnosis was schizophrenia, the standard label for women who heard voices and believed impossible things. She spent the rest of her life in Byberry State Hospital in Philadelphia, one of the most notorious asylums in American history, a place where patients were warehoused in conditions that would eventually trigger federal investigations and public outrage. She died there in 1968. Margaret visited once. She described walking through hallways lined with women who rocked and muttered and screamed at nothing, and finding her mother in a common room, calm, almost peaceful. They sat together for 20 minutes. Her mother didn't recognize her at first. Then something shifted. She grabbed Margaret's hand and said very clearly, "It's in you too. I can see it. You're stronger than I was, stronger than grandmother, but it's there. When it comes, don't fight it alone. They'll lock you away like they did us. Find the records. Find out who we really are. It's the only thing that will make sense of it." Margaret never found the records. She didn't know where to start, didn't know what her mother meant, didn't want to know. She lived her life, raised her own children, and tried to forget that conversation. But she couldn't forget what her mother said about it being in her too, because by the time Margaret was in her 50s, she was starting to notice things. Moments where reality felt thin, where she heard whispers in empty rooms, where she became irrationally certain that people were lying to her, plotting against her, hiding things that she needed to know. She never told anyone. She managed it, controlled it, lived with it until she died at 81, and she watched her own daughter, Christine, for signs of the same thing. Christine is still alive. She's 64 years old. She lives in Oregon, and she was the one who started looking for the records. Christine started researching her family history in 2001, after her mother's death. She was looking for medical answers, trying to understand a pattern of mental illness that seemed to run through the women in her family like a curse. She found Mary Catherine Sullivan's birth record. Then she found Johanna's asylum admission papers. Then she found Franziska's death certificate. And then she found something that changed everything. A letter archived in the Austrian State Archives, dated March 1872, from the office of Emperor Franz Joseph to the Habsburg family physician. It authorized a payment of 10,000 florins to cover the expenses of relocating the affected daughter to America, with the explicit instruction that all records of her existence be sealed for 100 years. The letter named her Franziska Johanna von Habsburg-Lothringen. Christine spent the next decade tracing the bloodline, connecting documents that had been deliberately separated, finding evidence that historians had overlooked or dismissed because it seemed too implausible. She proved beyond any reasonable doubt that she was the great granddaughter of Austrian royalty, that her family's mental illness wasn't random bad luck, but the genetic legacy of centuries of inbreeding among European nobility, and that she, like her mother, like her grandmother, like every woman in the direct line, carried the same genetic markers that researchers now associate with increased risk of schizophrenia and related disorders. The Habsburg jaw had been studied extensively. The hemophilia that ravaged European royal families was well documented. But this, the hereditary psychosis that destroyed the women of the Habsburg line, had been hidden, covered up, erased from official histories because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging that the bloodline that ruled half of Europe for 500 years was fundamentally broken. Christine published her findings in 2014. Academic historians confirmed the documents. Genetic researchers examined the family medical records and found patterns consistent with inherited mental illness. The story made headlines for about a week. Then it disappeared because Americans don't care about European royalty. And the Austrian government certainly wasn't going to acknowledge that they'd shipped a mentally ill princess to America and buried the evidence. But Christine kept researching, and she found others, descendants of other Habsburg daughters who'd been sent away, scattered across America under false names, their children and grandchildren living ordinary lives, never knowing they carried royal blood and a genetic time bomb. Some of them had started showing symptoms, some of them were in institutions, some of them had died by suicide, never understanding why reality felt wrong, why their minds betrayed them, why they couldn't trust their own perceptions. The photograph that started this story, the one that no one talks about, is kept in Christine's home. Franziska in her court dress, looking like royalty, looking like every other Habsburg portrait except for one detail. Her eyes. If you look closely, if you know what you're looking for, you can see it. The same expression that appears in photographs of her mother, of her daughters, of all the women in the line. Not sadness exactly. Not fear, something else. The look of someone who knows that the walls between what's real and what's not are thinner than most people think. That blood carries more than just genetics. That some legacies can't be escaped, no matter how far you run, no matter how many names you change, no matter how many generations pass. The Habsburg monarchy fell in 1918, but the bloodline didn't end. It just went underground, and somewhere in America right now, there's a woman who doesn't know she's descended from royalty, starting to hear voices in empty rooms, starting to see threats that no one else can see, starting to understand that something in her blood isn't right. And she'll never know why, because the family that could have told her sealed the records, faked the deaths, and erased every trace of the women they threw away. That's the real horror, not that it happened, but that it's still happening. The genetic legacy of empire hidden in ordinary American families, destroying lives that should have been normal. All because 300 years ago, a family decided that keeping power mattered more than keeping their children sane.